Who are the protesters supporting the opposition in Venezuela? Months of unrest and chaos have divided the country. Protests are showing no sign of ending, and the economy is spiraling further out of control. And President Nicolas Maduro continued to resist calls for an election to replace him. This is Inside Story. Hello, this is Inside Story. Welcome to the program. I'm Rochelle Carey. She is barred from leaving the country and her assets are frozen. Venezuela's chief prosecutor, Luisa Ortega, is to face trial, accused of violating her constitutional duties. The ruling socialists say she's a traitor for opposing an attempt to strip the opposition-controlled National Assembly of its powers. The outspoken critic of President Nicolas Maduro accuses him of creating a climate of terror. The action against the nation's top law enforcement officer came hours after a helicopter attack on the Supreme Court. A lot to discuss with our guests. First, though, Teresa Bo reports from Caracas.
Roadblocks in Caracas, a day after a rogue police helicopter appeared to attack the country's Supreme Court.
It's all very strange, and I think the government is trying to use it to divert attention. How can it be that they're going after everyone here, and it took them such a long time to find the helicopter? Everything sounds ridiculous.
The helicopter's pilot is said to be a member of the forensic police unit called Oscar Perez. The helicopter was found in the state of Vargas late on Wednesday. The government says it has deployed special forces to track the pilot. Venezuela Supreme Court took the threat seriously.
We've ordered the court to assemble a group of magistrates so we can denounce this terrorist attack, which had one goal: to change the constitution and this country's democracy.
In spite of the threats, the Supreme Court's credibility is once again being questioned. It has issued a ruling saying that it's broadening the powers of the Ombudsman Office, powers that the Constitution says belong to the Attorney General Luisa Ortega, a strong supporter of Hugo Chavez, who says Venezuela's constitutional order has been broken.
The Supreme Court is made up of the main actors who are degenerating the Constitution, and I will not allow that. There is a clear intention to annul the public ministry with this sentence. These actions are undemocratic and dismantle the state.
Ortega has been banned from leaving the country. Her assets have been frozen and has a trial date for next week. For many, an example of how the government punishes detractors. Violent protests have been continuing in Caracas for 3 months, as the opposition accuses the government of Nicolas Maduro of trying to take over state institutions. But the government says the opposition is trying to overthrow Maduro and say that the vote for the Constitutional Assembly will take place on July 30th.
These people say they are not afraid. They have gotten used to regular clashes with security forces, with the regular use of tear gas. And they're saying that they will do everything possible to oppose the Constitutional Assembly, even though the government says that they will detain them.
Teresa Bo, Aljazeera, Caracas.
Let's take a closer look at some of the problems facing Venezuela. Venezuela is deeply split between supporters of the socialist policies of the late President Hugo Chavez and opponents who want an end to the 18 years in power by the United Socialist Party. Venezuelans are heavily dependent on oil revenue, which finances social programs and food subsidies. The economy became unstable when oil prices fell. 3 months of almost daily mass protests have been held. The anti-government protests were sparked by a legal bid to assume the power of the opposition-controlled National Assembly. President Nicolas Maduro accuses the opposition of trying to overthrow the legally elected government. Let's bring in our guest now. In Washington, Sonia Schott, Director of Schott International Consulting. She specializes in Latin American relations with a special focus on Venezuela. In Caracas, joining us via Skype, Lucas Kerner, the editor of Venezuela Analysis, and in Miami, Antonio Mora, journalist and Latin American expert. Welcome to all of you. I'm going to start with what I think is probably one of the most dramatic developments. a helicopter attack on the Supreme Court. Antonio, what do you make of this? This helicopter has been found. The pilot has not. What do you make of this?
It's hard to tell, Rochelle. This could be a legitimate thing, an officer, a policeman, an elite. He's a member of an elite unit who actually may have had some sort of delusions of grandeur and thought that he might be able to spark some sort of rebellion against the Maduro government. That is, one argument. The other argument, which many people in the opposition believe, is that this is all a false flag, that this is a ruse by the Maduro government, which has done certain things similar to this before to try and get more support from what little support he has inside the country, to try and get people riled up on his behalf, sort of showing and arguing that this guy is a terrorist. He also accused a former minister of the Interior, a Chavista, somebody who was a very big Chavez ally, of being involved in what he called terrorism and supporting this guy. So there are many things that Maduro gets out of this if this is a ruse. He can try to increase power. It also distracts from all sorts of things that are going on in Venezuela that are negative for the Maduro government.
Lucas, your take, is this something that Nicolas Maduro can use to his benefit?
I think it's pretty ridiculous to speculate whether this is a false flag attack, given that there's zero evidence to support that claim. It's just parroting opposition discourse. And I think that we don't speculate in Colombia if terrorist attacks are terrorist attacks, given that even though the Colombian state has ties to paramilitary groups. I think we have to put in the context that this is an opposition that has actually participated in the 2002 coup, whose leaders were active participants, and who have recently called for the military to take up arms against the government, as recent as Leopoldo Lopez a few weeks ago and Julio Borges in April. So this is an opposition that is violently attempting to overthrow the government, in which over 86 people have been killed, at least a large number of them, directly attributable to opposition political violence. At least 23 people have been killed directly and indirectly by opposition political violence, whereas 13 deaths are directly attributable to authorities. I think that,
and that's something that you have proof of.
This is, you can go to VenezuelaAnalysis.com. We have a detailed study in which we've been analyzing every case, and we update this death table daily. I can talk about individual cases such as Oliver Villacamargo, who was basically shot in the face and an opposition barricade quite 10 minutes away by car from my home.
Lucas,
that barricade.
Lucas, Antonio wants to get in on this. Sonia,
this is ridiculous.
Go ahead, Antonio.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to preempt Sonia here, but this is ridiculous. The reality is the overwhelming number of deaths and the overwhelming number of injuries have been people in the opposition, not people related to the government. The violence there is ample evidence of the violence, and Lucas is completely taking the government position. Most of Venezuela Analysis' information comes from the Venezuelan government, and the reality is Venezuelan Analysis has been funded by the Venezuelan government, so we should be very clear where Lucas is coming from here.
All right, and
we're going to Lucas. Can I invite
Lucas, just a moment. Lucas, hold on, just a moment. This could go back and forth for the entire half hour. We do have a third guest, and I do want Sonia to be able to get in on this. Sonia?
Yeah, actually, I believe the government is in control of whole Venezuela. So the government is responsible for whatever happened in Venezuela. And we have seen in the past days when the opposition took the streets in Venezuela, and currently is happening today, and the government sent the troops in order to wound, to jail, to kill people in Venezuela. So I think the monopoly of the force in Venezuela is in the hands of the government. So the government is responsible for whatever happens in Venezuela.
Having
so
said
that's
that,
why the opposition, they don't trust what happened with the helicopter. It could be a move in order to keep people distracted from what happened, from the reality in Venezuela, which is Venezuela is right now in a deep crisis. It's facing a deep crisis politically, economically, and social crisis too.
Antonio, are there cracks in Nicolas Maduro's support?
Certainly, and that's one of the things that Nicolás Maduro may want to distract from. And again, I'm not arguing either way on the helicopter pilot. I think everybody is just speculating on that. On that, I just put out a couple of the arguments. The reality is, the helicopter was over downtown Caracas. There's an airport where there are military assets right, minutes flight from there. So if the government wanted to stop this or catch the guy, they could have caught him. So I am inclined to think that this is a little fishy, but the reality is that is something that needs to be considered in all this. But Maduro they have emasculated the power of the Asamblea Nacional. They went in there with force on Tuesday night and kept the congressman hostage. Luis Ortega Diaz, who is the Fiscal General, sort of an attorney general equivalent in Venezuela, who is a longtime Chavista, an ally of Chavez, she has come out against many of the actions that the Venezuelan government has taken. They have now banned her from leaving the country. She is in serious trouble. This other minister of the Interior I mentioned earlier, also a big Chavez ally, has also gone against the government. So there are divisions, and those are things that Chavez does want to distract from.
Lucas, let's talk about that, Luisa Ortega. Is there a reason to believe that there will be more arrests, more detentions of people by Nicolás Maduro?
I would like to invite my fellow guests to actually come down to Caracas and see for themselves if the territory is controlled by the national government, because yesterday I went to pick up my father from the airport, and literally we were almost trapped in eastern Caracas due to the barricades, which may last something like 5 or 6 kids. This is a small minority of protesters with the impunity of the local governments in these right-wing eastern municipalities and wealthy municipalities that are basically holding large sections of Caracas absolutely hostage, and the government is not doing anything. The government's response has been completely.
The government's not doing anything.
If it's the wealthy,
the national government has not responded.
If it's the wealthy areas, Lucas, what happened?
If I could just can I finish my point? In these areas that are controlled by the opposition protests, these barricades are some of the most violent instances that are occurring. Orlando Figuera was burned alive in Altamira on May 20th. He was doused in gasoline and burned alive. There's no justice in this case. Where is the justice from the public prosecution, from the Attorney General? Where had they found, there's a policy of impunity that is being promoted by the Attorney General, who has openly accused the government now of state terrorism after a
so
terrorist
hold on just a minute. Antonio, we'll get to you in just a moment. But the Organization of American States has tried to take a stand against this, to say that what is happening is too heavy-handed. Now, obviously, the resolution failed, but there are people that are saying that what is happening is not okay, Lucas, and that it's not all the opposition, that the government's response has been disproportionate, been heavy-handed.
Indeed, there are 13 deaths that are attributable to authorities. There have been indictments in all of those cases. There have been cases of excessive force being used. But I just invite my fellow listeners panelists to think about what would happen if you had over 13 weeks of violent protests calling for the destitution of the legitimately elected government in Washington. What would happen then?
You know perfectly well, Lucas. Come on, please be honest here.
Lucas, let Antonio. Lucas,
be honest.
Let Antonio speak now.
Lucas, be honest. These protests began and were peaceful protests, massive protests, millions of people around the country. Please don't say that this is a small movement against the government. That's absolutely absurd. And you know perfectly well that the violence has been generated mostly by the government with intense repression, and there is plenty of evidence of this. You're talking about small groups of people that are, a barricade, and that's somehow, that the Venezuelan people have control of the country. The weapons are all in the hands of the government. This is a country that, as Sonia said, is totally controlled by the Venezuelan government. And sure, can hundreds of thousands of protesters take over certain avenues and certain highways at times? Of course, but they do not have the power. If not, that government would not be in place right now. And the reality is, you know perfectly well that if democracy were working, there would have been a referendum last year, and Nicolás Maduro would have been voted out of power. So let's be honest about all this.
Sonia. Let's be clear, when we talk about the opposition, sometimes that's a very general term. Who would you say is actually the opposition, or are they unified in what it is that they want?
Yeah, actually, I know that the opposition has been accused of being divided, because the opposition is actually, there are so many groups, political groups forming the opposition. But if we say that the opposition is divided, the Chavistas too, because there are some people who are still loyal to Chavez, and others that are loyal to Maduro. But the Maduristas and Chavistas, they are not on the same path. And this is what we see right now. A lot of people who were supporters of Chavez, they are still supporting the Chavez movement, but they don't support Maduro because of what is considered a mismanagement of government. We can see that every day in Venezuela. And that's what has led to the crisis, what we see today.
So, Antonio, the protesters would say that Chavez and Maduro ran the country in the ground. That's what they would say, right? But there are others that would say that their lives changed, that their lives improved, that they were lifted up out of the barrio. Is this a class war that's going on?
Right. I mean, certainly the wealthier classes opposed Chavez from the beginning, and Lucas is correct. There was an attempted coup in 2002. But we should remember that Chavez came to prominence when he attempted a coup in 1992. So there is that issue. But the reality is all the polls have shown that more than 80% of Venezuelans are anti-Maduro. Did Chavez raise people out of poverty? Yes. Unquestionably. Did oil prices soar during the Chavez years, which allowed him to do much of that? Also, yes. And the reality is poverty now under Maduro has gotten much higher than it ever was historically in Venezuela, where their numbers say that more than 80% of people in Venezuela are now over the poverty line, which is why the opposition is completely across all classes and across the whole country geographically.
Let's talk about that. We can't talk about this without talking about the collapse of oil, right? 95% of the economy in Venezuela is based on oil, and then the price of oil collapsed. But Sonia, the price of oil has actually affected a lot of countries, right? Not necessarily devastated them the way that Venezuela has been devastated. What are the other factors that made this so much worse in Venezuela?
Well, actually, Venezuela has always lived from the oil revenues, and the situation hasn't changed. So, but not only the prices, the oil prices, but also the corruption and the mismanagement of the government, the lack of provision, the lack of setting a project, a plan for the future, invest in the country. That's what we see right now, and that's why right now the government is facing a lack of resources, and the situation with the oil prices will continue because we don't know. But for the short period of time, the oil prices will remain low, considering the role that the U.S. has taken in that regard, rising its production and adding to this fracking technique in order to produce more oil. So there are so many elements, and Venezuela is still stick with the with an oil economy. Mm-hmm. So I don't see how the situation will improve in the near future.
You actually brought up a point that I definitely wanted to discuss. Lucas, to what extent do you think that U.S. policies have perhaps exacerbated the situation? I don't know. What is your take on that?
I think the United States is completely playing a role in funding the Venezuelan opposition and actively, which, you know, it supported the 2002 coup against the government, has actively admitted resolutions over the past few weeks supporting the violent protests, refusing to condemn the violence. The United States, you know, is responsible for change continuing in Latin America. There's no doubt that the U.S. is playing an interventionist role in Venezuela and the region. I would like to invite, I wish Antonio were here on April 8th to see that when the beginning of the opposition protests, when the protesters set the Supreme Court building in Eastern Caracas on fire, and then they did it 3 more times over the course of 70 days. So I think that they were always violent. And then I think that about the barrios, the reality is that yes, there are more protests in poor neighborhoods, but the reality is that the barrios that rose up on the kind of Caracazo in 1989 and who toppled the coup regime in 2002, they have not risen up. And if the barrios were to come down, this government would not last a day. And that speaks to the reality that there's a more nuanced situation in which, yes, people are extremely dissatisfied with the government and with the current crisis. However, the vast majority of the poor support base of the government does not agree with the radical demands of the opposition for an early presidential election. They want Maduro to be able to finish his presidential term.
What radical demands?
In 2019.
Antonio, what radical demands?
to call for an early presidential
What radical
election when
demands,
President
Lucas?
Chavez's term-
All they were asking was to follow. Wait, they were following the Chavez Constitution in asking for a presidential referendum. They followed it to the T. This is the Constitution that the Chavistas chose for Venezuela, and which they have celebrated as the greatest thing in the world. They asked for a referendum legally, constitutionally, and the Chavez folks, and that has been condemned by every international organization I know. They avoided that referendum because they knew they were going to lose the election, just like they massively lost the parliamentary election a couple of years before. So again, let's be honest. And the reality is, the barrios aren't coming down in the biggest numbers because, as in Cuba, for example, it's very hard to think about protesting and rebelling when you're struggling to get food. You know what the numbers are and how people are starving in Venezuela, how kids are dying, how the World Food Organization, I believe, came out with a number recently that 12% of kids in Venezuela are severely have severe malnutrition, which means that they're in danger of dying. Come on, let's be real about the situation there. And the reality is, Rochelle, you made an important point.
Go ahead.
Because things were much better in 1989 than they are now. They were much better in 1989, and you can look at all the economic factors in 1989. Things were much better in 1989.
Okay.
You can come to the
barrios. Lucas, you can look at the numbers. You can look at the economy in Venezuela. It's just not. It is absolutely not comparable.
Inflation is at 800%. That's a fact. Inflation is at 800%. The IMF says that it may go to 1,100%.
The Bank of America Merrill Lynch inflation
rate, and it wasn't that in 1989, nor was the poverty rate over 80%.
Antonio.
It did, but there were
Antonio, Lucas, guys, just a moment.
And Rochelle, you made an important point about how oil prices have not caused the same kind of devastation anywhere else in the world. The reality is the Maduro government and the Chavez government before it, it's very simple. It's socialism with corruption, as Sonia said, which is corruption that is on a scale. Always there has been corruption in Venezuela, but on the scale which we're seeing now is something that we've never seen before. But socialism has led to a series of price controls that have ended up. If you're a company, are you going to produce something if you're forced to sell it at less than what it costs you to produce it? Of course not. They have imposed all sorts of economic policies that have been absolutely disastrous for that country. They have also confiscated all sorts of private companies. Sure, and one quick last point.
Go ahead.
And Chavez also devastated PDVSA, the Venezuelan petroleum company, and Venezuela produces less oil now than it did when Chavez came into power. That's another big problem for Venezuela.
Sonia, how much worse do you think this can get?
Oh, okay. That's the $1 million question, because nobody knows. Every day in Venezuela, you think this is the worst day in Venezuela, but it could be worse tomorrow and day after tomorrow, because there is no end. Unless both sides, they agree to find a solution, a democratic solution, in order to find a way out.
Sonia, do you think that solution would require some outside pressure?
No, outside pressure, no. I think Venezuelans, they have to take the means in their own hands. But there is the Constitution. The Constitution also provides a way out in order to solve the crisis. And I think one of the democratic ways will be to call to early elections. Why will be the purpose of waiting and waiting? Well, when the country is destroying, is falling into a chaos, completely total chaos, and the crisis, and the people, they don't have food, they don't have medicines, they don't have anything. And how much longer we need to wait in order to find a way out for the crisis?
Certainly one of the worst declines that we've seen for a country that used to be one of the wealthiest in Latin America. That's going to have to be the last word. We'll be continuing to cover this. I'm sure we'll call on all three of you again. Thank you very much, Sonia Schott, Lucas Kerner, and Antonio Mora. And thank you as well for watching. You can see the program again anytime if you visit our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Rochelle Carey, and the entire team, bye for now.